Hello and welcome to Hidden History, Understanding the Origins of Racial Inequality in the U.S. I'm Brian Conybeare from ABC 57 News, your host for this discussion on the role that historical events inequity in American society. The history we learned in school really only part of our country's story, and sometimes the parts that are overlooked or not covered in the history books can actually illustrate how things came to be the way they are these days. Recent events, from the death of George Floyd at the hands of police in Minnesota to the assault on the U.S. Capitol building this year, have heightened the interest in the differences in how Black and white Americans view and experience the country we share. This is the first of three panel discussions we're going to have over the next 3 months that will really span the scope of American history from 1619, when slavery was first introduced, all the way to the present day. Panel one tonight will be focusing on the earliest period in American history, beginning when slavery was just introduced. We have three panel Grand Rounds Initiative and by Lakeland, Michigan College in Benton Township with the cooperation of the city of St. Joseph.
Hi, my name is Michael Gary, Mayor of St. Joseph, and I'm a history geek, especially when it allows me to connect the dots between events that happened long ago and our current society. When it comes to the differences we see between the conditions of Black and white Americans today, we need to understand where and why those differences started. I invite you to join us for a series of three panel discussions that will shine new light on some of the origins of disparities in health, economic status, and political power to our country and this area. The educational outreach is designed to foster a better understanding of the impact of structural racism on community members and society at large. As a unified Berrien County effort, we hope the community will come to a stronger appreciation of where we've been and gain the commitment to make a better community for all of us. Thank you for participating.
My name is Lynn Todman. I'm Vice President of Health Equity at Spectrum Health Lakeland. For generations, our schools, our hospitals, our courts, and other systems have instituted policies and practices that have led to health inequities, differences in health that are unfair and avoidable. Many of these policies and practices are rooted in our country's history of structural racism, and they've led to unspeakable illness, disease, and early death in communities of color. Community Grand Rounds is designed to increase our understanding of structural racism and to illuminate a path forward toward health equity. Our next event is a three-part series titled Hidden History, Understanding the Origins of Racial Inequality. Historians and documentarians will share how historical events and decisions, even those made centuries ago, have created the health inequities that we aim to eliminate today in Berrien County. I hope you enjoy the series.
Hello, I'm Dr. Trevor Kavatsky, Lake Michigan College President. On behalf of the Board of Trustees and the entire LMC family, welcome to this important series of panel discussions. Learning about the policies and practices that laid the foundation for systemic racism not only gives us a better understanding of today's racial inequalities, but can guide us as we do the work it takes to create a real and lasting change. LMC is honored to be part of this project, and we thank you for joining us for this essential conversations in the community.
And thanks to all of you for making this happen tonight. Our goal in these discussions over the next 3 months isn't to cover every single aspect of U.S. history, but to highlight specific events that may not be real well known to the general public, but that possibly can help us understand how race-based inequity came to be. How did we get to where we are now? Let me introduce our panel for you for the evening. Dr. Christy Clark-Pujara is an associate professor of history at the University of Wisconsin. Dr. Cabria Baumgartner is an associate professor of English and American Studies at the University of New Hampshire. And Dr. John Wells is a professor of history at the University of Michigan. If their discussions prompt any questions, we want your involvement. We want you to give your input and to ask questions. Submit them through the Zoom chat. That's how we're going to do this. You submit the questions. I'll then direct them to the panelists after their presentations. We'll begin with Professor Clark Pujara. Slavery, of course, was a very big business, but it was by no means confined to the South or those port cities where slave ships docked and from which all the cotton was shipped back then. Slavery and the wealth it generated in a variety of sectors formed a basis for much of the American economy in both the South and to the North as well. And the control of that wealth was divided along strict racial lines at the beginning of U.S. history. Here is Professor Clark Pujara.
Thank you for that introduction. First, I just want to have a note on language. You will hear me say some offensive words tonight, and that is a result of me quoting. That is not my language, but that is when I quote. So just want to say that. I also have a little bit of cold. It is not COVID. I'm actually fully vaccinated. But if you hear me cough or need to take a drink, that is why. And thank you all for being here this evening. Throughout the northern colonies and states, enslaved men, women, and children labored in the business of slavery. Their collective labors sustained the multitudes of enslaved people that cultivated sugar in the West Indies and tobacco and rice in the southern colonies and states. Nowhere was the connection more salient than Rhode Island, where the business of slavery was the cornerstone of the economy. The enslaved, however, refused to be treated as simple objects or products. They resisted their bondage and strove to build full lives within the strictures of slavery. You're going to hear me say the business of slavery a lot, so I want to define that. I define the business of slavery as all economic activity that was directly related to the maintenance of slaveholding in the Americas. So in North America, in the Caribbean, the West Indies, the islands in between, North and South America. Specifically, the buying and selling of people, food, and goods. It was the business of slavery that allowed New England to become an economic powerhouse without ever producing a staple crop. You may say, why am I focusing on Rhode Island? Rhode Island is one of the best places to study the impact of the business of slavery because it was both exemplary and exceptional. So what Rhode Islanders were doing as colonists and then later as citizens was happening throughout the northern colonies and then later states. What makes Rhode Island unique is the intensity in which they did it. Next slide, please. Like their northern neighbors, Rhode Islanders bought and sold people and supplies that kept plantations in the Americas thriving. However, Rhode Islanders were the most deeply invested. New England, excuse me, next slide. New England colonists supplied other colonists in the West Indies with enslaved people, livestock, dairy products, fish, candles, and lumber. In return, they received cash and molasses. They distilled that molasses into rum. Molasses is a byproduct of sugar production, right? And the sugar islands were where the money was being made, right? Sugar was called white gold. And all of the arable land was cleared in order to grow more sugar. And everything else is imported. It made more economic sense for planters in the West Indies, those are the islands in between North and South America, to import all of their food, all of their firewood, all of their livestock, rather than grow and support that themselves, right? And so this creates this West Indian bilateral trade between Northern colonists in North America and colonists in the West Indies, right? And so, like I was saying, molasses is a byproduct of sugar production. And molasses becomes a really important trading good because it's what you need to make rum. And rum was in great demand throughout Western Europe. And it becomes the #1 export out of the northern colonies. So this trade began in the late 17th century and flourished in the 18th century as rum becomes a currency in and of itself. It was the West Indian trade that propelled Newport out of Boston's shadow and into the status of a major city and established Providence as a major port. Right? And rum becomes the #1 export out of Rhode Island. It's also an export out of Connecticut and out of Massachusetts. Again, Rhode Island is just an example. Next slide, please. Prior to 1696, the English Royal African Company had a monopoly on all English participation in the Atlantic slave trade. New Englanders began sending slave ships as soon as the monopoly was lifted. These voyages grew increasingly common and profitable. And in fewer than 30 years, Rhode Islanders dominated the North American trade in slaves. And the slave trade evolved into one of the pillars of the local economy. The vast majority of the slave ships that embarked from British North America left from a port in Newport or Providence, even though it was the smallest and least populated colony. During the colonial period in total, Rhode Islanders sent some 514 slave ships from their coast to West Africa, while the rest of the colonists, so this is North and South combined, sent just 189. And less than 20 slave ships leave from a port in the South. This was a Northern business. After the Revolution, Bristol, Rhode Island becomes the primary slave trading port. And in 20 years, between 1787 and 1807, Rhode Islanders transported some 45,230 Africans to bondage, only about 10,000 fewer than they had in the previous 70 years. You might be thinking, how do I know these exact numbers? Because this was a business and we have the business records. And these slave ships were also taxed. And so we have the government records. As historian Jay Cottrey argued, the North American trade in slaves was essentially the Rhode Island slave trade. Next slide, please. I usually don't like to read anything to anyone when I am doing a PowerPoint, but in this case I will, and I think you'll understand why I've chosen to do that. This is a law from 1703 in Rhode Island, and it demonstrates how race had become so central in how the colony thought about Black and brown people. And I'll let the words speak from themselves. This is not me being sloppy in my translation. This is how the law was written. So this is a direct quote. As you can see, they didn't pay much attention to punctuation and spelling then. So, and I'll quote, "If any Negroes or Indians, either freemen, servants, or slaves, do walk in the street of the town of Newport or any other town in this colony after 9 o'clock of the night, without a certificate from their masters or some English person of said family with them, or some lawful excuse for the same, that it shall be lawful for any person to take them up and deliver them to the constable." I'm not picking on Rhode Island. There were laws like this in every colony, North and South, but it criminalized skin color, making skin color meaningful, right? This law isn't about anything that anyone has done. It is not about behavior. It is about the existence of Black and brown people. It doesn't matter if they're free. It doesn't matter if they're a servant, and it doesn't matter if they are enslaved. Their very existence was criminalized. Any of them that are out after 9 o'clock of the night without a white person is subject to be taken to the constable. This makes all white people responsible for the surveillance and policing of all non-white people. And all non-white people are deemed suspect, not because they've done anything, but because they exist in a space after a certain time of night. This is what race-based slavery produced, right? It produced a society in which Black and brown people are criminalized for being, and it doesn't matter what their status is. And all white people, no matter if they're filthy rich or dirt poor, have power over them, the power to deliver them to the constable. We were racist as a country before we even became a country. It is in the DNA of the nation. Next slide, please. Made in part from cotton picked by enslaved people, Negro cloth, also known as kertsey, was a cheap, coarse cotton blended material mixed with wool, and it was manufactured especially to reduce the cost of clothing enslaved people in the American South. So if you do like a newspaper search from the antebellum period, so 1820 to 1860, and you type in Negro cloth, all kinds of ads will come up. This was slave clothing. Between 1860 and between 1800 and 1860, more than 80 Negro cloth mills opened in Rhode Island. Rhode Island's tiny, right? It is 30 by 40 miles. So this means at every river fall, because these were water-powered factories, there was a slave-making endeavor, right? A slave clothing-making endeavor. By 1850, the majority of Rhode Island textile mills manufactured slave clothing. So while all New England mills manufactured slave-grown cotton, Rhode Islanders were almost solely dedicated to the manufacturing of slave clothing. They were doubly dependent on the business of slavery. And free Black people were barred from working in these factories. Next slide. Industry in the North and in New England in particular was directly tied to the business of slavery. Many of us learned about the famed Lowell Mills in the Industrial Revolution in school. But what often isn't told in parallel was that that textile revolution, that industrial revolution, wouldn't have been possible without the expansion of slavery and the cotton kingdom that was powered by slave power, right? It's the hands of enslaved people that are producing the cotton that is fueling the American Revolution. And it's not just about the factories. Where do the plantations get the capital to buy people and equipment? Banks in places like New York and Philadelphia and Boston. And they insure people and they insure their plantations, right? New York Life and Company had insurance policies that you could buy on enslaved people, right? And so the entire industry in the North is tied up in the business of slavery. Farming implements, where were they going? They were going to plantations in the South. And we all have a tangible connection to slavery. I'm willing to bet that almost everybody on this webinar owns a pair of jeans. Negro cloth was the precursor to the modern jean. Levi Strauss buys its patent from a Negro cloth mill in Rhode Island. It was initially work clothes. Now it's just thought of as ubiquitous American fashion. But jeans were work clothes, right? They wash well, they wear well. Our jeans, of course, are much nicer and a lot more stylish than kertsey was. Next slide. The business of slavery in Rhode Island dictated geographic patterns of slaveholding in the colony, as well as the work done by enslaved people. Enslaved people in the North did not produce a stable crop. Instead, their labor helped sustain the multitude of enslaved people that cultivated cash crops elsewhere in the Americas. Most enslaved people in rural areas lived on farms with 3 or 4 other enslaved people of African or Native descent, as well as white indentured servants. In the countryside, especially in the Narragansett country, these bound people labored as cow herders, shepherds, dairy farmers, and produced small amounts of grains, vegetables, cheese, and fish. Most enslaved people in urban areas were either only 1 or 2 of bound people in a household. In the coastal cities of Newport, Providence, Warwick, and Bristol, they worked as domestics, tradesmen, manufacturers, day laborers, and shopkeepers. Next slide, please. The agency of many enslaved people countered the attempts of enslavers to view and treat them as commodities. In 1673, Negro servants Maria and George were indicted for fornicating. They were both found guilty and sentenced to 15 stripes. In 1707, an unnamed Negro man was reportedly murdered his enslaver, ran away, and drowned himself rather than be captured by officials. The General Assembly declared and ordered, and I quote, that his head, legs, and arms be cut from his body and hung in some public place near the town of Newport to public view, and his body be burnt to ashes, that it may please, if by God, be something of a terror for others, perpetuating the like barbarity for the future. In 1714, a mulatto man ran away from the city of Newport. In 1728, Jethro, an enslaved Negro, stole a canoe from his master, Robert Wilcox, a yeoman from Kingston, and paddled to Martha's Vineyard and hid among the Indians. Again, when you hear me say things like Negro, mulatto, that's not my language I'm quoting. In 1734, Hezekiah Gorton's Negro man was found guilty of poisoning two white women, Anne Markham and Rebecca French, with contaminated apples and milk, and was ordered, and I quote, tied or bound to the public whipping post in said town and stripped naked from his waist upwards, receiving 25 lashes on his naked body, end quote. Maria and George acted outside the control of their enslavers when they had sex. They were willing to risk severe punishment for companionship. Both the mulatto man and Jethro robbed their enslavers of their human property. They stole themselves. The poisoner embarrassed his enslaver by poisoning his guest. Moreover, he could have killed them. These individual acts of resistance were as varied in motivation as they were in execution. Some were in search of autonomous relationships. Others may have sought revenge or found themselves caught in a moment of anger that led them to kill or plan to kill or cause illness. Some were seeking temporary or permanent escape from slavery. And although these acts of resistance were not aimed at destroying the business of slavery, their actions did interrupt the business of their enslavers. Moreover, their actions of enslaved people defied racial ideology of their enslavers. These people were anything but simple property. Thank you.
Professor Clark Pujara, thank you very, very much. Very informative, and I had no idea that it was actually illegal for African Americans to walk on the streets after 9 p.m. in Rhode Island in 1703. That is eye-opening stuff right now. Now we want to turn to Professor Baumgartner. Since the time nobody wants to be a slave, of course. Some of the larger rebellions are very well known, but others took place far away from the fields and may have had just as significant as an impact. So let's go to Professor Baumgartner with that part of the story tonight.
Good evening, and thank you all for joining us for this session on slavery and abolition in American history. Building on Dr. Clark Pujara's great presentation, I'll talk about the transition from slavery to emancipation in the 19th century North. And I mean slavery to emancipation and not slavery to freedom, as some might say. Freedom was very much a process in the United States. It didn't come about just because slavery gradually ended in the North. And to make this point, I'll focus on education as a path to freedom, and Black education in particular as a means of resistance to racism and inequality. Next slide, please. This illustration from the American Anti-Slavery Almanac depicts the destruction of a school for African American girls and women in Connecticut in 1834. This attack was linked to similar incidents in New Hampshire and Ohio, where lawmakers and the mob conspired to destroy Black schools. In my research, I estimate that attacks on Black schools erupted at least a dozen times in the 19th century North. So why did mobs and lawmakers oppose Black schools? Well, it's partly because mobs hated radical social movements like abolition, because abolitionists aimed to abolish slavery in the United States, and many of them sought to achieve racial equality in the United States. Some opponents to abolition and also to Black education confessed that they also feared the very idea of Black equality and citizenship, so they resorted to violence, including attacking Black schools. Mobs and lawmakers also devised plans to remove African Americans from cities and towns in the North through so-called Black laws, which were meant to discourage Black migration to certain states, Ohio being an example. And they also sought to remove African Americans by way of colonization, which aimed to send African Americans to West Africa. But what's important here to remember is that African Americans resisted in their words and through their actions. In a rousing speech, the 19th century African American lawyer, Robert Morris, declared, "This is our country. We are American citizens. The sweat of our brows has watered the soil. Our labor has cut down trees, cleared the wilderness, and built villages, towns, and cities. This is our country, and we intend to stay." African Americans like Robert Morris cared about learning, and they cared about education. So they fought for their educational rights, and schools became a battleground in the 19th century North. I want to draw our attention to this school for African American girls and women depicted here under siege. It provides a window into African American women's educational activism. We know who some of these students were. We know why they sought an education, and we know how they contested white violence and racism. Next slide, please. Amid terrible violence and harassment, young African American women at this school embraced an ethic of Christian love, defined by biblical principles such as love God and love thy neighbor. In their writings, these students quoted scripture, they prayed to God, and they reassured one another that love and justice would prevail. This ethic of Christian love allowed young women to share their vision of a peaceful, just, and loving community. It was an act of social protest. It was a bold declaration of African American belonging. So just as Robert Morris said, "This is our country and we intend to stay," so too might these women have said, "This is our school and we intend to educate ourselves." Next slide. So how did this school for African American women come to be? Well, Sarah Harris was definitely a catalyst, and this is a photo of her many years later after she attended this school. Sarah Harris had dreams of becoming a teacher. And in September of 1832, at around 20 years old, she applied for admission to the Canterbury Female Seminary in Connecticut. Now, Sarah's application for admission was bold because her presence would mean desegregating an all-white school. Next slide. Now, Prudence Crandall, pictured here, was the principal of the Canterbury Female Seminary. Crandall was a white Quaker woman from Rhode Island, and she had been recruited to come to Canterbury to open a school for young white women. And Crandall School was one of many seminaries established for young women in the United States, both in the North and the South and the Midwest. This was really common. Most young women who attended these seminaries were about 12 to 18 years old, and they came from middle class and elite backgrounds. So Crandall had to consider Sarah's request for admission. She suspected that some of her white students might be disturbed, that was her word, by the idea of attending classes with a young African-American woman. But she wanted to help Sarah, and she wanted to help Sarah achieve her dreams. So she admitted her. Next slide. And Sarah's admission to the school completely unsettled the village of Canterbury. Parents of the white students demanded Sarah's immediate dismissal, And then they threatened to withdraw their daughters from the school altogether. So desegregation here was a non-starter. Prudence Crandall then made a game-changing decision. She closed her all-white seminary and opened a new school exclusively to train African-American women as teachers. She placed an ad for the new school in the abolitionist newspaper, The Liberator, which you can see here on the right. And she traveled the Eastern Seaboard to recruit African-American women students. The new school opened in April of 1833 with about 20 to 25 students in attendance. And while some of the students came from middle class and elite free Black families from New York, Rhode Island, and Pennsylvania, others were supported by grandparents who had once been enslaved. Next slide. So let's peer inside the school to get a sense of the structure. There were 4 white abolitionists who taught there. Prudence Crandall, as the proprietor, as the principal, opened and closed the school day with prayer. Students learned reading, writing, grammar, and geography. Other classes included chemistry and botany, along with electives such as drawing and French. Crandall and her students attended church services too, and they welcomed preachers to the school. Young African-American women students even wrote editorials that were published in anti-slavery newspapers, expressing a great sense of joy being at this school. One student commented, and you can see it here on the left, "It is not until the present moment that we have begun to enjoy that which our minds have long desired. That is to say, the advantages of a good education." So this remark exemplifies Black women's joy in learning and being part of an intellectual community. African-American activists also praised these students. Sarah Mapps Douglas, who's an African-American teacher from Philadelphia, wrote a public letter encouraging more African-American girls and women to be courageous, put your trust in the God of the oppressed, and go forward. And young African-American women did exactly that. They went forward, enjoying their pursuit of knowledge. Next slide. White Canterbury residents, however, responded to Black women's joy by pursuing discursive, legal, and then extrajudicial attacks. They maligned African-American women's character in the press. They accused one student, Anne Eliza Hammond of Rhode Island, of being a vagrant. And they fined her and then threatened to whip her if she didn't leave Canterbury. Then they drafted and pushed through the Connecticut General Assembly legislation that forbade the establishment of any school in the state for the education of colored persons. So this so-called Black law effectively criminalized Prudence Crandall School. And in June of 1833, Canterbury officials arrested Prudence Crandall for violating the Black law. Next slide. Now, Prudence Crandall's students reacted to white opposition and racism by adopting this ethic of Christian love. This ethic of Christian love didn't preclude them from labeling the actions of white Canterbury residents as wrong, as evil, and as unjust. But these students reminded one another that Crandall had taught them not to indulge in angry feelings towards our enemies. By quoting scripture on forgiveness and loving thy enemy, these students promoted a course of action that meant upholding Christian principles of love and peace. Crandall students also proclaimed that they belonged to a universal Christian family. One student linked Christian love to the fight for racial equality. As this student explained, African Americans and whites shared a common father. Racial prejudice then didn't make any sense, and all good Christians had an obligation to fight it. These students applauded Prudence Crandall and showed her to be a great example of a white person who stepped from within the shadow of prejudice and are pleading our cause. So for these students, the fight for racial equality and freedom was both a Christian duty and a national cause that required white people to stand up and to act. Now, I don't have time to delve into the specifics of Prudence Crandall's legal case, except to say that there were 3 trials over a year-long period. In the first trial, the jury couldn't reach a verdict. And the second trial actually resulted in Crandall's conviction. She then filed an appeal to the state Supreme Court, Connecticut, and in that third trial, the court dismissed the whole case on a technicality. Now, as the legal battle played out, right, late 1833, early 1834, acts of violence were still directed at the school. In June of 1834, a 1-pound stone was hurled through one of the school's windows, landing in a student's room. And there was also a case of arson that had taken place. Next slide. On the night of September 9th, 1834, a mob attacked the school, smashing most of the windows, leaving the building, in one student's words, almost uninhabitable. No students were physically harmed. However, we're left to only imagine the psychological harm. Prudence Crandall felt that there were no options left. She had to close the school for the protection of her students and for their safety and her own. Next slide. Though violence abruptly halted their education, these young women remarkably still championed an ethic of Christian love. In a short essay published in The Liberator, which you can see here on this slide, one student shared her memories of friendship at the school. And not only had she maintained her faith in God, but she also remained committed to extending that love to her neighbors. The student also credited one of her teachers, Samuel May, with helping her develop her sense of religion as a living, all-pervading principle of action. Samuel May lived like those who seek a better country. And that inspired the student. And what happened at Canterbury roused other abolitionists to establish schools for African American women in the North, from Pennsylvania to Illinois to Michigan. Next slide. And long after the Canterbury School for African American Women closed, former students held steadfast to its guiding principle and spirit, this ethic of Christian love. While Sarah Harris never received the schooling she desired, she chose to educate herself and her family. Her daughter Isabella went to a high school in New Bedford, Massachusetts, and Sarah encouraged her on more than one occasion to improve your time at school. Other students who attended Crandall School continued to promote racial and gender equality while asserting their freedom and citizenship rights. Their activism took various forms, from writing and petitioning to organizing, lecturing, and even filing lawsuits. Yet no matter their form of activism, there were 2 common principles that drove these women. First, they refused to accept the idea that the existing educational system was the best possible. For them, the fight for equal school rights, that is the right of all to a quality education on an equal basis, was a matter of freedom and justice. And second, they were inspired to pursue knowledge and to reform American schooling and teaching in ways that were inclusive and transformative. And these same 2 principles motivate educational activists today who carry on this fight for educational justice in the United States. Thank you.
And thank you very much, Professor Baumgartner. Interesting information there, particularly that school in Connecticut for young African-American girls. Finally, in this portion of our discussion, we welcome Professor Jonathan Wells to the dais. He will remind you that I want to remind you actually, that there's a question and answer period at the end of this. We've gotten some questions in already. You can use the Zoom chat feature to type your questions out, and we'll try to get to as many of them as we can in the last half hour of this event. Right now, though, we want to go to Professor Wells and the idea of maintaining that peculiar institution of slavery became very, very costly as those slave rebellions proliferated and the abolition movement grew in the middle part of the 19th century. It also began to be more of a political issue for everyone from congressmen to local police departments enforcing the laws in those border states and elsewhere in the North, right? Slavery was down South, but it still had major impacts in the North, as we're proving tonight. The economic benefits of slavery had actually created a white middle class at that time that was eager to preserve its status. Professor Wells picks up the story from there.
Thank you very much for that introduction. You know, as we've just heard with these two amazing talks, the fact that racism was foundational to the American experience from its very beginnings in the 1600s and in the 1700s with the Rhode Island involvement and complicity in the slave trade, and with the kind of racially motivated horrific attacks on a girls' school that Dr. Baumgartner just let us know about. So, you know, given those examples, it probably wouldn't surprise us to understand that the nation's founding document, the Constitution of the United States, is a document that in many ways compromises with American slavery. And there are a few ways in which that becomes evident. One is the 3/5 clause. Another is a stipulation about the slave trade, the transatlantic slave trade. But the one I want to draw our attention to tonight is the Fugitive Slave Clause of the United States Constitution. Of course, we often revere the Founding Fathers and the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution as almost like a civil religion. And we tend to exalt them and put them on a pedestal. But the truth is that the Constitution itself was a compromise document among politicians. And the Fugitive Slave Clause is perhaps the most egregious example of that truth. The Fugitive Slave Clause simply said that if somehow you were able to make it to freedom, if you were an enslaved person in the South, and against tremendous odds and at great personal risk, somehow you were able to cross that Mason-Dixon line from Virginia into Pennsylvania or from Kentucky into Ohio, that did not mean that you were free. In fact, the Fugitive Slave Clause required northern communities to return runaways upon the claims of the supposed master. So, you know, yes, it's true that the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence are our two most perhaps important founding documents, are stories of liberty and freedom and the pursuit of happiness. It's also true at the same time that the denial of freedom was fundamental to the nation's founding. And of course, you've just heard that with the two previous amazing presentations. The fact that the North is required to return runaways essentially makes northern communities complicit in the operation of slavery. And nowhere, I think, perhaps aside from Rhode Island, is that more true than in New York City. And what I want to do for the next few minutes is talk about America's metropolis, you know, the city that we all associate with you know, global capitalism and sort of the quintessential American city and freedom and liberty and the pursuit of financial gain. And in fact, I argue in a recent book I did called The Kidnapping Club that New York City is the most pro-slavery, pro-South city north of the Mason-Dixon line. And that's not something I say lightly. And let me tell you why I think that's the case. First of all, and this was something that Professor Clark Pujara alluded to a few minutes ago, New York City really benefited tremendously from enslaved grown cotton. All of those thousands and eventually tens of thousands of bales of cotton are going to be harvested by enslaved laborers, and they will be baled up and taken to cotton markets in places like New Orleans. And then they're going to be destined, as Dr. Clark Pujara mentioned, for textile mills in New England. They're also going to be turned into finished products in textile mills in the UK. And New York City, particularly the Wall Street financiers, the banks, the insurance companies, the merchants, they are facilitating the movement of all of those bales of cotton from southern ports to the places where they're going to be turned into finished products. And in many ways, the rise of New York City, the rise of Wall Street, and by extension, the rise of the United States is heavily dependent upon the slave-grown cotton that is tremendously profitable for both South and North. So New York City is very much aware of the fact that its prosperity, its growing power as a global financial capital is heavily dependent upon keeping slavery intact, keeping the bales of cotton flowing through their fingers, and outfitting all of the ships and all of the transportation supplies that are necessary to take those bales from the South and to their final destinations in New England or perhaps in the United Kingdom. The other thing that makes New York City perhaps the most pro-South, pro-slavery city north of the Mason-Dixon line is the fact that it's a very Democratic Party city. Now, you all probably know that in this period of American history, so the period before the Civil War, 1830s, 1840s, 1850s, the Civil War is going to break out in 1861. So the decades before that means that the Democratic Party is the party of racial intransigence. They're the most virulently racially conservative party in the United States. And so it's much different than the Democratic Party is today. But in this period, if Donald Trump had been alive in 1830s and 1840s and 1850s, he more than likely would have been a Democrat. And the Democrats are very much dependent upon keeping the North-South union together, right? Why is that? Well, of course, they want to support the great American experiment. They want that grand experiment in democracy to continue. And if it happens that we have to appease white slave owners with the fugitive slave laws and return runaways every so often, then so be it. And the fact that New York City is dominated by the Democratic Party, the ultra conservative party when it comes to race in this period, and the fact that it is so dependent upon the cotton trade makes New York City a very dangerous place for African Americans in the decades before the Civil War. So dangerous, in fact, that a nefarious group arises. We talk about institutional racism. Here is sort of a concrete example of what that means. New York City is so arrayed against the interests of Black people, the legal system, the economic system, the political system, that a group called the New York Kidnapping Club is able to operate throughout the 1830s and into the 1840s pretty much without any fear of reprisal whatsoever. And it really wasn't an organized group, but it's pretty darn efficient at using the Fugitive Slave Clause in the Constitution to accuse any Black person who they come across for being a runaway. They might meet them, in the alleyways of Lower Manhattan, or in the streets of Brooklyn, or perhaps along the wharves of the East River or the Hudson River. And a white person, whether it was a policeman or a lawyer, could go up to a Black person and say, ah, I know you. You're Joseph Smith, who escaped from Virginia back in 1825. I'm arresting you as a runaway. And it didn't really matter, as it turned out, whether that person was in fact born free in New York and had lived their entire lives in that status, or whether they were in fact self-emancipated, whether they had run away. And at the sort of apex of this kidnapping club are two police officers, two members of the NYPD. One of them is Tobias Boudinot, and he's kind of the arch villain of this true story. But he and his buddy Daniel Nash, along with a lawyer named Fontaine H. Pettis, how's that for a good 19th century name? They really conspired to approach Black people, men, women, children, and accuse them of being runaways. And as soon as they did that, they would take that individual before the city recorder, a guy by the name of Richard Riker. And unfortunately for New York's Black population, Richard Riker's democratic politics dovetailed quite nicely with his deep-seated racism. And he really cared little whether somebody was demonstrably born free or somebody who was in fact a runaway. He didn't exert a great deal of effort to find out which was true. And so through these efforts of the New York Kidnapping Club, untold numbers of Black New Yorkers were literally swept off the streets of New York City and the streets of Brooklyn and sold into Southern slavery before sometimes even their loved ones knew they were missing. That's how efficient all of this is. But it's not without resistance. And I think it's often easy, I think, to dwell on the horrors of all of this. You know, the institutional racism exemplified by the Constitution, exemplified by the attack on the Canterbury School, exemplified by Rhode Island's complicity in the slave trade. These are all pieces of information that we need to know. But it's also important to underscore Black resiliency. And here I want to highlight for just a minute or two a guy by the name of David Ruggles. And he is somebody who deserves to be much better known among Americans than he is, in fact, today. He is a Black political activist in New York City. He is essentially the Frederick Douglass of pre-Civil War New York. And he tirelessly roams through the streets of New York. He goes to Brooklyn. He walks along the docks, along the Battery on the southern tip of Manhattan. And David Ruggles keeps his ear out constantly for any cases in which Tobias Boudinot or Richard Riker or Fontaine Pettis or anybody else has colluded to sort of cheapen or endanger Black lives. And Ruggles is, you know, he's sort of an imperfect hero, right? He's an agitator. He's a troublemaker. He doesn't always make nice in the way that people were expected to do in 19th century America. But it's because of his tireless agitation that, you know, the activities of the Kidnapping Club really come to light. In fact, Ruggles is the one who calls them the New York Kidnapping Club, and he publishes a newspaper called the Mirror of Liberty. And if you're interested in it, you can Google it and see what it looks like. And in the pages of this newspaper, he publicly names Tobias Boudinot, Daniel Nash, Richard Riker, Fontaine Pettis as members of what he actually labels the New York Kidnapping Club. So, you know, as demoralizing the institutional racism can be when we look at American history, I think it's important also to take solace in the tireless work of people like David Ruggles. In fact, David Ruggles suffers physically from his activism. He dies at a young age. He dies about 40 years old after his eyesight had been failing for a number of years. I don't think he was actually really diagnosed with anything specific. But, you know, in short, he gives his physical being, he gives his existence to the fight against institutional racism in America's metropolis, in New York City. So I want to end on one other point here, and then we can certainly go to the Q&A. And that is the fact that we are talking about the North's complicity in American slavery is not by any means an attempt to take attention away from the crimes against humanity that the South inflicted for 200 plus years in the form of American slavery. Nothing any of us could or would do would diminish the horrors of Southern slavery. But by focusing or perhaps refocusing our attention on Northern complicity in slavery, in the slave trade, in the business of slave trading, I think what we're doing is we are drawing attention to the fact that slavery was endemic to the entire nation and its founding. And I think, again, the Constitution demonstrates that perhaps more clearly than anything else. Thank you.
Professor Wells, thank you very much for that enlightening presentation as well. It's now time to go to the Q&A portion of tonight's event. And I want you to use the Q&A feature here on Zoom, not the chat function. The chat function we're actually using for some internal housekeeping, but use the Q&A function. And we have gotten several very good questions, and I want to read one for you right now. The first one comes from an anonymous attendee. They didn't put their name on this one, but it's a question for Dr. Clark Pujara. Do you see a link between the criminalization of you mentioned the laws prohibiting being out after a certain hour to be common among the colonies and the policing of Black and brown people today? Is there still a link from those early laws to the policing of today? Dr. Clark Pujara, what do you think about that question?
My short answer is yes, right? That Black people have been conceived of as criminal before we were ever a country. And when Black people were free, they weren't free in the context that we would think them be free. And an example of that would be the antebellum North. You know, everybody knows how slavery falls apart in the South. Very few people know about how slavery falls apart in the North. And it's because it's really complicated. There were enslaved people in the northern states at the dawn of the Civil War, right? There were few of them, but they were there, right? New York abolishes slavery in 1827. Rhode Island, 1848. New Jersey never does, right? And so it falls apart slowly and haphazardly throughout the North. But the free Black people who are there are heavily policed, right? And they are not recognized as citizens, right? And so that carryover continued even when slavery falls apart. Black people can't serve on juries. Black men can't join the militia. Transportation is segregated. Black people aren't supposed to be in certain parts of town. And if they are, they get attacked by white mobs, right? And there is no reprisal for that. So it was open season on Black bodies because Blackness was interpreted as the antithesis of citizenship, right? And so this continues on, right? With Black people being seen as suspect, right? And I think that this is particularly true in the Midwest. And I say that as a Midwesterner. I was born and raised in Omaha, Nebraska. I went to school in St. Paul, Minnesota, went to grad school in Iowa City, Iowa. But when, you know, national news pundits say the Midwest, they don't mean me, right? And when I go places, I'm not seen as, you know, a true Midwesterner. Why? Because of the Black laws that didn't want Black people to settle here. So I absolutely do, right? That Blackness in and of itself is seen as suspicious in this country.
And, you know, from my own personal experiences, I have friends who, you know, from Benton Harbor, who don't necessarily feel comfortable going across the river to St. Joe. Benton Harbor is about 85% Black. St. Joe is about 85% white. And to this day, there are folks in Benton Harbor who don't want to go to St. Joe because they get followed in stores. People look at them funny. The police stop them. And that's why we're having these discussions, to try to get to the root of this and to open people's eyes. So thank you for that answer. I want to get another question. This one is from a participant named Max Murray. And it says, regarding your point of the business of slavery, Eric Williams in his dissertation called Capitalism and Slavery made the point that, quote, slavery was not born of racism, Rather, racism was the consequence of slavery. What is your view on this opinion? And I'll open that to all three of our panelists. Does anybody want to jump first? I guess that's a no.
I can quickly say racism was created to support the economy of capitalism, right? And that's not my opinion. Like, we can just follow it in the law. And when Eric Williams wrote that dissertation in 1944, he was roundly dismissed by the Academy. Now it's been taken seriously, and slavery and capitalism is its own field. But you can go to somewhere like colonial Virginia and see the creation of race-based slavery. You know, I think it's 1661, Virginians pass a law saying that you follow the condition of your mother. So now you're going to be born free or slave. This is weird in an English colony where you follow the condition of your father. So we're going to create a law to say you're going to follow the condition of your mother. And then we're going to pass another law that says the only people who can hold slaves must be white. So now we're giving pigment real meaning. And then we pass another law that says, if white people do this, this is the punishment. If Black people do this, this is the punishment. Then you pass another law saying it's illegal for Black and white people to marry, right? So there was nothing normal or natural or inevitable about race-based slavery. It was an artificial system that was created to support the plantation economy. And we can see it colony after colony, whether we're talking about North America, South America, or the islands in between. You create a system of race-based slavery.
Thank you very much for that response. Another question, this one from someone named Nicole Mack. How can we help current society, she asks, see the connections to these historical oppressions and our current disparities in the current day? And I guess that's what we're doing here in particular, is trying to shine a light on that. But Professor Baumgartner, what do you think about that? Are enough people having these conversations right now? Obviously, racial inequality and Black Lives Matter and all the racial injustice protests are sparking some conversations, but are enough people hearing these things?
I'm not sure if I can assess if enough people are hearing it, but I know that conversations are happening, and I know that we need to be listening to each other. This event is a great example of the kinds of conversations we can be having about how history informs the present. I think Professor Clark-Pujara just nicely sort of summarized how the past and racial slavery connects to the present. And when we think about policing and issues of violence. So we need more of these discussions. One of the things that I try to do in my own work, certainly I've written an academic book, but I often try to write what we call popular or public writing about the past, and I try to draw specific links to the present. I'm not in the business of public policy, but I have been interested in talking more to policymakers about educational equity. So there are a lot of conversations that we can have. There's a lot of ways in which the academy, and particularly scholars and historians, can influence and shape policy.
Certainly the New York Times with their 1619 project, if you've been paying any attention to that, is trying to open that discussion and open eyes to the history of racism and inequality here in the US and its lasting effects as well. Let's get to another question. When this one is from, I can't read the first name, Mitchell Garcia, Mr. or Mrs. Mitchell Garcia, asks, when and why did slavery become more of a Southern business as opposed to Northern? Professor Wells, you want to tackle that one?
Sure. It was both a Northern and a Southern business all throughout the colonial period, as Dr. Clark-Pujara reminded us. And that goes all the way, into the early part of the 1800s, right? The early part of the 19th century, much later than I think many of us commonly assume. So it's not as if it shifts from a Northern to a Southern business. The point really, I think, at least from my perspective, is that both regions, both North and the South, all the way through the most of the 19th century, benefit in different ways, but also very powerfully from the business of slavery. And what that tells us is that, America itself is deeply implicated in the business of slavery. And you can't necessarily separate what was happening in New York City with what was happening in New Orleans. I mean, they are tied in complicated ways that I think we're still teasing out. And as Dr. Baumgartner just mentioned, I think historians are increasingly trying to reach out to, a broader audience instead of just writing, for each other's benefit. And I also think, to be honest, the reading public has to do a better job of, picking books off the shelf that are not Bill O'Reilly's, killing Jesus, killing whatever the latest money-making enterprise is, as a sort of charade of history. And so, the scholarly work has to be done to reach out more than we have to people in the public to let them know what we're thinking about and working on. But, I think it's incumbent upon folks who are interested to, not fall prey to these, halfway histories and reach out for something that might be a little more challenging, but on the other hand, be a lot more rewarding.
To be
I'd just
perfectly
like-
honest,
I
go
would
ahead. I'm
just
sorry.
like to add really quickly to what Professor Wells is saying. I think that we so much think about, and this was true of myself until I got to graduate school, think about slavery as a Southern institution because the vast majority of enslaved people lived and labored in the South. And that it wasn't a function of like morality. That was a function of climate and soil, right? You cannot grow the cash crops that were grown in the Southern colonies and states in the North commercially, right? You can't grow tobacco all season long. You can't grow cotton. You can't grow rice, right? Like those are the cash crops. You can't grow sugar, right, in New York City. And so it's not a function of, people in the North were nicer or didn't like slavery. The climate and the soil doesn't allow for the expansion of cash crops the way that the climate and the soil in the South do. And I think that sometimes that we forget that just kind of basic fact, that's why there were so many more enslaved people in the South because of cash crops.
And it is all economic based. Here's a question on a similar vein that I'll throw out to all of you. It comes from Lois Goldrick. She says, I'd like to hear about the northern companies that were involved in providing loans for purchasing slaves, much like an auto loan, and the insurance industry that insured the lives of slaves as one would insure their property. I heard about this on a slave trade tour in Charleston, South Carolina. I wonder what companies were involved. And have they ever apologized? I think somebody mentioned some of the big insurance companies. Are those, some of those big companies, that were involved in this kind of business still out there that we're, doing business with to this day? The banks, the insurance companies?
Yes. New York Life and Company, they've talked about it. They've apologized for it. JP Morgan Chase, right, was a company that was transporting enslaved people from the upper South to, Texas. If you were successful in the 19th century, you were tied to slavery. And I don't say that facetiously. That is how money was being made. If you were a successful broker, you were brokering cotton because cotton was 58% of all US exports. Right? If you were invested in steamboats, you were invested in the business of slavery because what's carrying the cotton from the north, from the South to the North? If you were invested in the, train companies, it's everything, right? And so there really are no clean hands because the center of the economy was built out around the labor of Black bodies.
Interesting. So some questions for Professor Baumgartner, I think here, two of them actually, I'm going to kind of put them together. About the female school in the Northeast for young African-American women, what were the age range of the females in the school is one question from Karen Dixon. And an anonymous attendee didn't really ask a question, but says educational equity continues to be a challenge today. And then there's a third question from an anonymous attendee. Was there also encouragement for education of African-American men as there was for women? Professor Baumgartner, can you address that kind of subject again?
Sure. So at the Canterbury School run by Prudence Crandall, the Black women ranged in age, so there were girls too there, 12 years old to 20 years old. And that was the range was similar for female seminaries generally in the North and also in the South. An example of a female seminary that exists today is Mount Holyoke College. So it becomes a college in the late 19th century, but when it's founded in the 1830s, it's a female seminary. So Prudence Crandall School was a female seminary, and that's where African-American girls and women could attend. As far as a question for African-American men and their education, absolutely. They were encouraged to pursue higher education as well. And they had a few more opportunities than African-American women did. So the earliest African-American men to earn bachelor's degrees were men who graduated from New England's hilltop colleges, so places like Bowdoin College in Maine and Amherst College in Massachusetts. We do have examples in the 1820s and 1830s of a few African-American men graduating from those colleges. Some scholars estimate that by 1860, approximately 28 African-Americans had earned degrees from recognized colleges, 28. And that's in comparison to thousands of white men and women who had earned college degrees or degrees in higher education. Most African Americans earned degrees, if they did, from Oberlin College in Ohio. It's a really important site for African American education. But interestingly, most African Americans who lived in the Northeast did not and could not really attend Oberlin College. We have to sort of think about the geography of the 19th century. It was quite a hike for some of those African-American youth to decide who were in Maine or who were in Massachusetts, to go to Ohio. So we're dealing with these were serious educational inequalities, but African-Americans were trying, right? And they were trying to use education, to see education as a path to freedom.
And we're still seeing some of that to this day here in the Twin Cities. The state of Michigan just last year threatened to shut down the Benton Harbor Public Schools and Benton Harbor High School, which is predominantly African-American. Of course, across the river in St. Joe, they have a school foundation, very well-funded schools, don't have all the debt, have better facilities. So these issues still certainly linger to this day. I have another question related to this, and this might be for you again, Professor Baumgartner, from an anonymous attendee. When did the education of Black men and women become acceptable in the North? Was it not an underlying practice that slaves must remain ignorant to maintain the business of slavery in both the North and the South? When did people really start opening schools up to African Americans and former slaves?
So I think Professor Clark-Pujara can maybe address the southern parts of this, but at least in the North in the 19th century, there really weren't anti-literacy laws as that existed in the South. The closest is probably Connecticut's Black Law, which I talked about, which basically forbade any school to be established in the state of Connecticut for the education of Black people who were from out of the state. So that's probably the closest that we have in the 19th century North to a kind of anti-literacy or anti-education law. When it comes to common schools, as they were called in the 19th century, that's basically what our public schools are today. Common schools, for the most part, depending on where they were located, accepted a few African Americans. Oftentimes, those common schools were segregated. And other times, if the city was there's a town, there might be some sort of level of integration. We have examples in classrooms of sometimes African American students being pushed to the corner, right? So there really wasn't a sense of total integration. What's really interesting, we think about African American women and their activism in the 19th century. We have examples in Massachusetts, for instance, in 1855. They basically passed a law forbidding racial segregation in their schools, right? And then Connecticut passed the law, a similar law in 1868. So we actually had this moment of maybe schools becoming integrated, maybe schools could become equal, and there would be a quality education for all. But there was this moment of backlash, this moment of regression that happened by the 19th century, and then schools are once again segregated. And we're still dealing with this today. And the example that you just gave, and also, here in Massachusetts, we have multiple examples of school districts that are maybe 10 miles apart, but really don't have equal resources. And that comes down to, to race and racial discrimination.
And that is still happening these days, no question about that. Let's go to another question. I would love to, this is from an anonymous attendee, I would love to hear from the panelists, well, now where'd that question go, how each of their own lives as Black women and a white man impacts their work studying this history. Let's start with Professor Wells on that. As a white male studying the history of slavery and the trials and tribulations of African Americans, how does that impact your worldview and what you do?
Well, that's a good question. I was born in North Carolina and grew up in North Carolina and in Florida. And one of the things that I experienced personally, although I didn't understand it then, was the need for school busing. And Dr. Baumgartner just mentioned the persistence of sort of racial segregation, and that is primarily, or perhaps most acutely visible in residential segregation. We as individuals, and I'm talking about, those of us who have the means to make a decision about, where they can live, have to decide whether they're going to live in an all-white suburb or whether they're going to live in a mixed race neighborhood. And that's the way in which I think integration, which is something I believe strongly in, is going to unfold. But unfortunately, the residential segregation that we have in this country today is more divided, or as divided as it's ever been. I live in Detroit. I made a conscious decision not to live in Ann Arbor, but to live in Detroit. And I'm fortunate in that I had the ability, the means to decide to do that. But I knew that racial segregation is something that white people in particular have to fight against. They have to vote with their feet. And so when I was bused as a kid to a school in the other side of town that was predominantly lower income and predominantly African American, of course, I didn't understand it then, but I perfectly understand it today as absolutely necessary. Unfortunately, we've resorted in many cities to a system of residential segregation in terms of our school assignments. In other words, we've done away with busing to a significant degree in an effort to go back to neighborhood schools. When I lived in Charlotte, North Carolina in the 90s and the 2000s, we had an integrated school system that was created as a consequence of the busing system. But then the city decided that it wanted to go back to a neighborhood schools program. And so lo and behold, no surprise to anyone, we resegregated the school system. This is something that was consciously done, knowing full well what the implications were going to be. And yet the city did it anyway. So I do study the history of the South. I do study the history of African Americans. And I think part of that comes from my own personal experiences growing up in the South, in North Carolina and Florida.
Very interesting. Thank you for sharing some personal history. Dr. Clark-Pujara, what do you think about that? How does your own ethnicity and family history impact your work?
I think it impacts my work from the standpoint that I always think about the people that I study, which are marginalized people, enslaved people in British and French colonial America before the Civil War. I think of them as full people, as fully human and as fully capable, as intelligent as resourceful, as resilient. And I think that sometimes historians don't do that. For instance, I'm very much interested in how the intellect of enslaved people was exploited. We often think about how their brawn was exploited, but what made enslaved people so valuable was the fact that you could teach them to do anything. So the governor of Rhode Island for 3 terms had an enslaved man as his, basically as his scribe and his secretary, because he got a fee to pay somebody to do that. He was given an allowance. Instead, he just pocketed it and taught an enslaved person how to do that, right? And those are the kind of things I look for, because I think about Black people as being fully capable, being fully human. And that comes from being a Black person that is just 3 generations removed from bondage. I was a late in life child for my father. He was born in 1931 or 1932, we're not sure, in rural Mississippi, outside of Meridian. My grandfather was born in the 1880s, and my great-grandfather was born in bondage. And so it is something that I have a real connection to. But then at the same time, in the scholarly world that I exist in, I am a minority, right? I'm an early Americanist. So I study the history of the colonies and the early republic. And so when I go to early Americanist conferences, when I go to colonialist conferences and spaces, I'm usually one of a few Black and brown faces in the room, right? When I was in graduate school, I didn't have a single professor that was Black. And so in my professional world, I exist as an extreme minority, but I bring the fullness of knowing the humanity and capableness of Black people to my study. And I don't equate, intelligence and being capable with having a formal education. The smartest man I ever knew was my father, who died 6 years ago, and he couldn't read a thing that I wrote. He was functionally illiterate. He grew up in the Jim Crow South. There was no school for him to go to, and he was from a sharecropping family. But he was the smartest person I knew. He owned his own home, he bought his own cars, and he ensured that his children had an opportunity against all odds, right? And so I value that, and I take that with me when I am investigating the lives of enslaved and freed Black people in early America.
Thank you. And that explains an awful lot why you care so much. I guess, Professor Baumgartner, the same question for you. How does your background and your family and your race, affect your work?
Well, I'll just say it was great to hear from Professor Wells and Professor Clark-Pujara about what motivates them and inspires them. I would say in some ways it's similar for me. I'm not a native of New England. I'm from Los Angeles, California, but I study early New England history, in part because that's where we get the formation of public education. And I wanted to think about how African Americans fit into that, where they were in that. And I realized that in part, we don't know the stories of not just African Americans, but African American girls and women. When we're doing archival research, particularly about the past, it's always particularly difficult to access, right? Their feelings, their thoughts, their ideas about whatever they're going through. In my case, just to get a sense of what it was like to go to school. It's very hard to capture that. But I kind of, enter the archive with a sense of defiance. I believe that there is going to be material there for me to use that's going to say something about African Americans. It's going to say something about African American women and girls. And I want to share that with as many people as I possibly can. It's really important in my work for me to show that African Americans have always cared about education. And I agree with Professor Clark-Pujara, it's not just formal education, but it's also informal education. They've always been fighting for it. They've been persistent in trying to achieve it, trying to reach it, and they've been thwarted along the way. But I think it's important for us to embrace African-American education and to do what we can to fight for that, for educational justice.
happening in the city of Benton Harbor right now. And to the credit of the folks at the St. Joe City Commission, this was their brainchild because they want to encourage these conversations on both sides of the St. Joe River in Benton Harbor and St. Joe, and get people to think about these things and think about their neighbors and consider them and not just live their own lives and forget about everybody else. Another comment from Corey Smith. First off, he says, "Thank you for these great presentations. My question would be, how do these scholars view their work in today's context? What does what they've studied teach them about today?" You're looking back at the past, but what does it mean to you today? Let's start with Professor Wells again, I guess.
Sure. I think it's absolutely central. I mean, one of the reasons why we study history is because we want to find out the context for current concerns, current issues. I mean, for example, you can't understand the bankruptcy of the city of Detroit in 2013 without understanding the legacy of racism and white flight and all of the economic impacts that the removal of white Detroiters to the outer suburbs had on the city. So, the short answer is we can't understand our current predicament, wherever you turn, whether it's politics, culture, society, you can't understand that without understanding the past. And I'll also add quickly that, if you're committed to social justice and racial justice, one way you can be an activist is to sort of present the history that very few people might know about. And I think that's one of the things that hopefully we're all doing tonight, which is, to underscore the North's complicity in slavery as a sort of stand-in for the American country's complicity in institutional racism. So I think those are the two sort of, reasons why I think what I do, at least, is relatable to the present.
We only have about 2 minutes left. And ladies, I do want to get to you, but I want you to answer this question, I think, instead. And it has to do with reparations. An anonymous attendee asked this: do any of you, in light of this history that you've all laid out tonight, what are your thoughts about reparations, such as what the city of Evanston, Illinois is doing, and in Manhattan Beach, California? Professor Baumgartner, let's start with you on that one.
I mean, I think it's a great question, and there's an excellent piece written about reparation by Ta-Nehisi Coates. I mean, it's one of those things where I think about late 19th, early 20th century, when particularly enslaved people, especially after the Civil War, recently freed, demanded reparations, right? It wasn't something we talk about it today, but they asked for it then, they demanded it then, and they were ignored. In the early 20th century, there was another charge, another demand for reparations, and they were ignored. So when we think about it now, right, it feels a little bit removed, but it doesn't erase the fact that African Americans have been calling for reparations for decades. I'm not familiar with what's going on in Evanston, but I am in support of programs, am in support of initiatives, particularly in education, but also in politics and other realms that support African Americans and people of color. And if that's a reparation, that's a reparation. But I want to do what I can, and I would like other people to do what they can to really bring about racial justice.
Thank you very much, ma'am. Dr. Clark-Pujara, you get the final word. What's your take on the concept of reparations today in places like Evanston and Manhattan Beach?
I think absolutely, but I think reparations needs to be national. The sin of slavery was national. The benefit from slavery was national. And when I tell people that, one thing I like to remind them of is just a really quick fact from my own research. The streets of Newport, Rhode Island were paved with duties paid on slaves. The streets of Newport, Rhode Island were paved with duties paid on slaves. If you never owned a slave in your life and you went to Newport and walked down the street and set up a shop or bought something, you benefited from slavery. Slavery built the infrastructure of this country. It's not about whose family owned a slave and who didn't. And beyond that, reparations don't need to just be paid for slavery. Reparations need to be paid for redlining. The Black-white wealth gap in this country is tied to the ability to buy a home, build equity, and then support a business, send children to school. And Black families were specifically and clearly barred from that process that happened post-World War II that created the white middle class with low interest loans backed by the federal government. Almost all of those loans went to white families, and Black families were disqualified, not because they didn't have jobs, not because they didn't have credit, but because they were Black. And if you don't know about redlining, you should educate yourself about it. It is the root of the wealth gap between Black and white people. So reparations, not just for slavery, but for what happens after slavery in Jim Crow America.
And that happened in, after World War II, not 400 years ago or something.
Absolutely.
So it is a conversation that we appreciate all of you joining us for this evening, and we certainly appreciate our panelists, Dr. Clark Pujara, Professor Baumgartner, and Professor John Wells. Thank you all very much for your insights, your time, and taking questions, on a topic that for a lot of people is difficult to discuss. So we want to keep this conversation going. We will have 2 more of these community grand round events. They are coming up next month, and also Tuesday, May 11th is 4 weeks from tonight. We'll email an announcement out on that to everyone who has participated here. There were some more questions. We could not get to them all in our allotted time, but the conversation certainly will continue. Now, as soon as we're done here, you'll also be getting an opportunity to answer a survey about tonight's discussion. So please take a moment to respond if you would. And if you want to pursue the topics on a more personal level, you can investigate Brave Talks. That's a home-based small group meetings that's part of the Community Grand Rounds initiative. My brother's been through it. It's fascinating. Once again, thanks to everyone involved tonight, our panelists and our sponsors, Spectrum Health Lakeland and Lake Michigan College, as well as the St. Joseph City Commission. For now, I'm Brian Connie Bear, ABC 57 News. Thank you for joining us. We greatly appreciate the discussion tonight.